the election goes. I mean, it just seems either result could produce a crisis of legitimacy and a crazy counterreaction. And say, so if Trump loses, the idea that QAnon cultists might take to the streets with their AR-15s, that seems all too plausible at the moment. And if he wins, I think the hysteria on the far left is likely to produce another break in social order, which would provoke its own very heavy-handed government response, very likely. So it's almost harder to picture the election happening without some scary level of disorder one way or the other than it is to picture the disorder at this point. And again, so much of this, if not all of this, seems to be on the social media companies to help prevent. Perhaps more about what they may or may not be doing in the handful of weeks remaining here, but how concerned are you about the election in particular?
Well, Sam, again, zooming out to the scale of these problems everywhere, Facebook is managing something like 80 elections per year where they have to throw resources at, listen, I care about this country just as much as you do, and the upcoming election in just something like 6 or 7 weeks. So I'm very concerned. I also just look at the growth rate. What is the rate equation for how fast are the harms and let's call it the madness machine growing versus how much have they been able to change the products, change the design, change the growth of those problems through better incentives or different policy changes? They have not been very successful. I'd say we've gotten less than linear, sublinear kind of change on how different Facebook is today from 3 years ago, compared to also the maximum incentive for bad actors to be manipulating the platform to their benefit. So the reason why, and I'm really not trying to toot the horn about the film, I just think that the only thing that sort of scales to the speed of the problem is culture. We really need to be a self-aware culture about the vulnerabilities of our own mind, which is not a blame. It's not you're bad or we should feel wrong for the fact that we're biased or have confirmation bias or get distracted or that social approval is so powerful to us. It's that we really don't have another way of dealing with it other than to become aware that our minds are not really going to be, living in social media at least, a trustworthy sort of sense-making environment. That's kind of the maximum goal that I have, is that we become a much more aware society in using these things. Because, as E.O. Wilson said, who's kind of we always use his fundamental quote as the foundation of our work at our nonprofit, the Center for Humane Technology, which is the fundamental problem of humanity is we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and accelerating godlike technology. And if I think about the clock rates of those three different features of humanity, our Paleolithic emotions are baked, thousands of years ago. Our medieval institutions are, passing laws at a relatively slow rate. And then our accelerating godlike technology is generating new categories of harm faster than we've been able to, build the cleanup truck and clean it up, right? Or even prevent it from happening. And I say that not to scare people, but to try to get an honest appraisal of the different rate equations for what we're working with here. And the only thing that meets that rate equation, even though I totally embrace and hope that the film and our conversation and everything else from so many other activists in the field accelerate the need for good legislation around these issues to change the incentives of technology companies away from the harms that we talked about. But the only thing that actually changes fast enough is if we can have a massive cultural movement that is in response to the fact not only that we can't depend on the platforms to fix these problems, but to rewind the tape and see that we're about 10 years into this mass psychology experiment that has warped the psychology of our minds, and that actually all of us are kind of running malware and bad code. It's not just that the other side is wrong, it's that all of us have been living in such narrow views of reality that we can no longer empathize with each other. And that shared understanding of why we're each so distorted is, in my mind, I think the only thing that scales to the current moment, so long as we're all, able to kind of get on board with that. One small thing that gives me hope, there's so many different countries that have been targets of these problems we've been talking about today. The film I just found out is #1 on Netflix in India, been #1 in Canada. And I think the fact that it can become something like a Silent Spring or Inconvenient Truth or, a Thomas Paine, common sense kind of call to arms, that we have to actually rewind our minds out of the entire psychology warp that we've been under. And the good news is I've been hearing from just families and from, heads of state even. I mean, I can't name names, but there's several heads of state who've seen the film and been just ecstatic that this is out there, that we can become aware of what this has done to society. And I think that's the only thing that scales in the short term to the size and scope of the problem.
So we have painted a fairly grim picture of the status quo and where this all might be heading. I love your concept of culture being the only thing that can move quickly enough to deal with this derangement. I mean, we really are talking about a derangement of culture in the end, and we need, presumably, we have some cognitive immune system, either internal to our minds or that can be placed in culture that we can rely on. How do you view us responding to this problem? What should people do or think about possibly doing?
Yeah, I mean, I realize that the conversation we've just had can leave people feeling, I can imagine, a bit dark, and I apologize for that. I think we have a culture that has been filled with, cancer cells, cancer information cells, and we have to strengthen our collective immunity. We need better mimetic immunity from, PSY operations and marketing and everything that's happening before the election. And I think, just like you wouldn't throw a plastic bottle on the street outside, I think we shouldn't be littering information that we are not expert in. I don't share information about coronavirus vaccine timelines because, I know that I don't know much about that topic. I think we need to all be deeper researchers of the incomplete information that's been given to us, be better at asking each other to explain their narratives to us because we may not have lived in the, epistemology that they've been living in their reality swap, learning how to better steelman each other's perspectives and unfollow outrage media. I do not follow any outrage media, whether it's MSNBC or Fox News or groups with thousands of people sharing information with utter certainty. I think we have to realize that these are not safe places to be getting our information. And we really need to rebuild our kind of cultural and epistemic immune system, realizing that no one wins in an environment where no one knows what's true. Like, this is not something that one side wins, right? This is a situation where everybody loses, because whether you care about climate change or racism or inequality, and you want to deal with these issues, it all depends on coordination and people coming to some kind of consensus on what is real and then what do we want to do about it. And I'm hoping that something like the film and more of a cultural movement will form afterwards that really re-engages us on how do we know what we know. I think we have not appropriately trained ourselves in epistemology, and I'm hoping that what you're doing here with your podcast and the kinds of questions that you ask also get more people engaged in that.
Yeah, we were talking before, now offline, about an exercise you recommend that people do of just swapping devices or swapping YouTube feeds, YouTube algorithms with a friend or a spouse or someone to just see how different reality looks. It's as simple as just looking at somebody else's, looking through somebody else's device, right, or looking on their Twitter feed.
Yeah. You could just, I think recommending that people, watch a film as a group and then, physically take out your phone at the end and just swap realities and just go through that person's YouTube feed or recommendations and see what they're being shown on the right-hand side, or go through the person's Facebook feed and see what kind of political news they're being served. There's actually a Mozilla tool called TheirTube, which is exactly this kind of reality swap where you can actually use someone else's YouTube recommendations. And I think even recording videos of that, like if someone said, you actually record, a husband and a wife or an uncle and a nephew or something doing a reality swap, and just what is the reaction when you really see how different this is? Because I think it's one thing for you and I to use phrases like political polarization or conspiracy theories over and over and over again. It's another thing to actually stare into someone else's world. And we're all living in the virtual realities that these things have created for us. And the only way we're going to pop out of it is having a more concrete understanding of what that actually is.
Well, when I do that with my 11-year-old daughter, I find that I'm watching a lot of the Merrill twins, which is
probably a healthier feed than looking at politics.
It's healthier than QAnon, but I'm not sure it's healthy in the end. Well, Tristan, you've done more than I think anyone else to raise awareness on this topic, and